So, today we are heading back to Melbourne to discuss one of the most truly shocking and confusing crimes to ever happen in the state of Victoria. And this case is heartbreaking for many reasons, but arguably the most shocking detail of all is that the victim in today's story is believed to have been killed in a case of mistaken identity. So let's head back to the year of 1997 on Muriel Street in the suburb of Nadree. There lived husband and wife Jane and Mark Thurgood-Dove. Jane and Mark, both in their early 30s, had met in school and had been together ever since. The couple had 3 young children together, their son, 11-year-old Scott, and the 2 girls, Ashley and Holly, aged 3 and 6. Mark worked as a factory foreman and Jane a stay-at-home mum, and by all accounts, the Thurgood-Dove family were very well liked and very happy. So let's discuss the warm and sunny afternoon of Thursday, November 6th. It was, as they always are, a day like any other. The kids were at school and preschool, and it also happened to be Oaks Day or Ladies' Day, something to do with horse racing, but honestly, I don't really know about that kind of thing. But besides that, it was a day like any other. Jane picked the kids up from school, as she always did, as Mark was at work, and headed home for the day. With the 3 children loaded into the back of the family's 4-wheel drive, Jane pulled into their safe suburban street in Nidri and drove up the driveway at about 3:40 p.m. Jane was the first to jump out of the car, and as she did, she was approached by this shortish, pot-bellied man wearing a balaclava and holding a handgun. Her oldest child, Scott, watched on in confusion as his mother began running around their 4-wheel drive, being chased by this pot-bellied man until she lost her footing and tripped. Her fall was followed by a bang bang before the man in the balaclava ran off towards a waiting vehicle on the street, a metallic blue Holden Commodore, and sped away. And young Scott was really confused by what he had just witnessed because he believed that this man in the balaclava was actually a friend of his mum's, just playing some kind of practical joke or a prank on her. But tragically, Jane Thurgood-Dove had been shot in the head several times in her own driveway in front of her own children and was killed instantly. The Holden Commodore, later discovered to be stolen, was soon found on nearby Farrell Street, or Farrell Street. It had been torched, which had resulted in significant damage, meaning that no DNA evidence could be extracted from the killer's getaway car. And this was, of course, kind of a bad start for the investigation. An investigation, of course, immediately began, led by Ron Iddles, who we have discussed here on the channel before. But if that name does not ring a bell to you, Ron Iddles is a former homicide detective that earned himself the nickname Australia's Greatest Detective due to his 99% conviction rate. So if anyone can solve this case, it's him. Ron Iddles started by talking to the witnesses to Jane's murder, which of course did unfortunately include her 11-year-old son Scott. His recollection was basically the version of her murder that I did just discuss with you. As his mum's killer was wearing a balaclava, he couldn't really give much detail about the perpetrator, but his pot belly was a detail that several other witnesses on Muriel Street did also recall. Of course, this isn't exactly the most specific detail because this could be like a million different people that are shortish and pot-bellied and male. The witnesses spoken to also described the getaway car driver, who wasn't wearing any kind of face covering, as younger and slimmer than the shooter, with shoulder-length greyish hair and a narrow face. So straight off the bat, the investigation believed that the killer had to be somebody that Jane knew, or at least to be hired by somebody that she knew, as it had kind of all the markings of a hit-type killing. Also, her murder seemed far too personal to be a random one, basically. Plus, I think that the statistic for homicide is about 98, maybe even 99% of killers are known to the victims. Don't quote me on this, but I do believe it is actually somewhere in that vicinity. And if you're not new to true crime content, I think we all know the old true crime trope is that the husband did it. So, of course, Jane's husband, Mark, had to be looked into. Mark did remain completely cooperative during the investigation, and he was very helpful throughout all of their inquiries. He unfortunately didn't exactly come off great in the media, leading some to believe he was guilty, but as we know from past cases, someone's behaviour in the media is not a reflection of their guilt or their innocence. The Peter Falconio case, for example, Lindy Chamberlain, I'm sure I could go on. So Mark was actually confirmed to be at work at the time Jane was murdered. So if he was responsible, he would have had to have hired someone. From all accounts, though, Mark was a loving and caring husband and a generally good person, so what exactly would his motive have been to have killed his wife? At least one person did actually come forward during the investigation, claiming that they were on good authority that Mark Thurgood-Dove had hired a hitman to have Jane killed, but this was never proven. And Mark also had no kind of criminal record whatsoever. The investigation also wanted to know why Mark had not called Jane on the day of her murder, as this was actually his usual pattern to call her every day from work. But on this day he had not. Had he perhaps known that she was about to be killed, so he skipped his usual daily call? Mark did explain to police that himself and Jane had actually been in an argument the night before she was killed. So the next day, instead of calling her from work like he did every afternoon, he decided not to and just let her stew over their argument. Which I think we have all done when we're mad at somebody, where we're like, nope, we're not going to contact them, we're just going to let them think about what they've done, and, well, it's not always the smartest move, I guess. In the end, though, this little detail really didn't prove anything, and there really was no solid evidence that Mark was involved in his wife's murder. And several years after Jane's passing, Mark was asked to take a polygraph test, which he did agree to, and he passed with flying colours, and ultimately he was ruled out of the investigation. So this leads me to suspect number 2. When police searched Jane's bag, they found a business card belonging to a man who also happened to be a serving and a well-respected police officer at the time. The investigation, of course, decided to speak with this man to ask him how he knew Jane. And this man, who has never been named, told investigators that 2 years previous he had actually hired Jane to clean his house, and this had led to a sexual relationship between the pair. I couldn't actually find anywhere if there was any proof of this affair or if it was even any kind of affair at all. After all, we don't know the type of relationship that Jane and Mark had, and I'm just not going to consider this an important detail in telling this story. What we can confirm, however, is that Jane and this police officer very much did know each other and had frequent contact. In fact, several of Jane's friends told the investigation that this police officer was obsessed with Jane. And when the investigation dug just a little deeper, this obsession was all but confirmed. When they visited the unnamed officer's home, they were greeted with a shrine or a memorial to Jane. And they also learned that his computer passwords were 17363, Jane's birthday. Or for my American friends, 31763. I'm sorry, but it goes date, month, year, not month, date, year, and yes, I will die on this hill. I don't understand the logic. Still love you, my American friends, but oh my gosh, every time I see a date written, I was going to say in American, but by Americans, I get so confused. No, day, month, year. Moving on, not important, regardless. Anyway, perhaps the most bizarre discovery of all when looking into this officer's obsession was the fact that he had tried to buy a plot, like a burial plot, next to Jane in the cemetery that she was buried in, which so strange, so obsessive. He even told the investigation that he considered Jane to be his wife, and he couldn't understand why he was not getting the same sympathy as Mark. You know, Mark, her actual husband. Just a very unusual circumstance. I don't know what to say about this guy, but yeah, strange behavior, but let's keep going. Let's keep going. So, when this anonymous officer was asked about his last contact with Jane, he told them that they talked on the phone for about 1 minute a week before her death. However, when the investigators followed up with this inquiry, it turned out that phone call had been over 1 hour long. Like, why even lie about this detail? As a police officer, of all people, you should know how easy a detail like this is to clarify, even back in 1997. So this obsession and the unnecessary lie alone didn't make him guilty, although he also did happen to match the physical description of the gunman. And also when police searched his home, they found a black balaclava and black gunshot powder, which was similar to black gunshot powder that had been found at the crime scene. Also, when the officer was questioned, he was unable to come up with any sort of solid alibi for the time of Jane's murder. I think it was also his day off, I read. For some reason, I haven't written this in my notes. And when questioned, the officer was unable to come up with any sort of solid alibi for the time of Jane's murder. However, the balaclava that was in his home was actually confirmed to be part of Army Reserve attire, so I'm assuming that he used to be in the army, and the gunshot powder didn't actually match the gun that was used to kill Jane, so at least that evidence could be put aside as unimportant. It was kind of a bit of a case of one step forward and two steps back with this suspect. He did seem pretty bloody guilty, but nothing could be directly pinned on him in order to warrant an arrest. Investigators also suspected that he had asked Jane to leave her husband, and when she refused, that maybe he had hired somebody to kill her, but again, there was no direct proof of any of this, just loose circumstantial evidence at best. Like Mark, this suspect was also given a polygraph test several years after Jane's murder. And when the question, "Did you kill Jane Thurgood-Dove?" came up, and he said no, it showed that he was lying. Of course, as most true crime enthusiasts know, polygraphs, while a helpful resource, are inadmissible in court. And while all of this was happening, this police officer was actually still working in law enforcement. Although there were, as you can imagine, calls for him to be stood down. But when the officer brought forward both medical and psychiatric evidence to prove that he was fit to continue to serve, along with the fact that no arrest had actually been made, he was simply a suspect, they had no choice but to continue to let him work as a police officer. And by 2003, this police officer was officially eliminated from the murder investigation. Although his behaviour was odd, to say the least, it appeared that he really didn't have anything to do with killing Jane Thurgood-Dove. So with the investigation at a total and utter loss, and both main suspects eliminated, in 2003, a reward amount of $1 million was announced for any information leading to solving Jane's murder. And it would be just half an hour after this reward money was announced that a tip would come through. So money really does talk, I guess, huh? So this is what the tipster told the police. As we know, Jane lived on Muriel Street in Niddrie. Her home was 3 houses from a corner property. She drove a four-wheel drive, had short blonde hair, and 3 young children. But also back in 1997, another woman not so dissimilar to Jane also lived on Muriel Street in Niddrie. She also happened to have short blonde hair, live in a home just 3 houses from a corner property, drive a four-wheel drive, and be a mother to 2 young children. Her name was Carmel Kiprianu, although some articles just used the last name Kipri, so I'm just going to say Kipri for the remainder of the video because I'm probably already butchering it. Anyway, Carmel Kipri, unlike Jane, was the wife to a criminal figure named Peter Kipri, and Peter was not particularly well liked by several criminals in Melbourne's underground. So according to this tipster, back in 1997, several bikies from Geelong, which is a city close to Melbourne, had been hired to kill Carmel as revenge against Peter for a dodgy criminal dealing. This part is going to get a little messy, but I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. Heading back to 1994 for just one moment, when a hit was first ordered on Peter Kipri by a man named Philip Peters, aka Mr. Laundry. So Philip Peters was actually a former lawyer turned money laundering extraordinaire, I guess, that was capable of washing millions of dollars worth of dirty money for those that requested it. Hence, Mr. Laundry. If you have ever seen Ozark, and if you have not, you definitely need to watch Ozark. Anyway, just consider Philip Peters the Marty in this story. So after a fraud scam gone wrong, Philip Peters put a hit out on Peter Kipri. However, the police, using listening devices and inside sources, found out about this hit and arrested Philip Peters and charged him with conspiracy to murder. He did get a relatively light sentence, however, of just a couple of years, and he was released just a couple of months before the murder of Jane Thurgood-Dove. So instead of going after Peter Kipri again, since police would be, of course, all over him, he decided to go after Peter's wife, Carmel. The hitmen hired by Mr. Laundry, the bikies from Geelong, connections that he had actually made that while he was in jail, are told to go find the woman that lives on Muriel Street in Niddrie, 3 houses from a corner block with short blonde hair, young kids, and drives a four-wheel drive, Carmel Kipri or Jane Thurgood-Dove. And these hitmen had actually been tracking Jane for several days before her murder, which can be confirmed by witnesses that saw the getaway car on Muriel Street just days before Jane was killed. Yet somehow they never figured out that they were following the wrong woman. Jane, unfortunately, had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Following Jane's murder, the Kipri family upped their security and stopped letting their children play on the street, as they had actually suspected from pretty much day one that the murder of Jane Thurgood-Dove was actually meant for Carmel. And at the time, Carmel actually did an interview with The Age discussing Jane's murder, which I did find kind of odd. But anyway, she told them, quote, "If it wasn't meant for her, it makes you wonder. It has made us wary. My husband says to watch out when we come home into the drive, to look around the place. I keep the door locked. Maybe it was for us, who knows? But you can't let it stop your life. The kids still go to school." End quote. And the Kipris do no longer live on Muriel Street, for the record. So if Carmel and her husband were stating just weeks after Jane's murder that they were the likely targets, why was this theory not explored in more depth during the investigation? Well, the answer is pretty simple. It's basically that the other theories that somebody that knew Jane committed the murder is more probable, or seemed more probable. After all, how many people are killed in a case of mistaken identity versus someone like the husband or the lover? By the way, I do believe this tipster was offered some sort of indemnity for all the information, which basically means they were protected from being prosecuted. Anyway, Jane's shooter and the person that organised the getaway car were also named. Former bikie Stephen John Morty was named as the killer, and Jamie Reynolds was named as the person that organised the car. To this day, however, as far as I could find, the actual getaway car driver remains unknown. So the investigation went to speak to the shooter, Steve Morty, only to find out that he had actually died back in 2001 from either a heart attack or a drug overdose, or possibly a combination of both, depending on what source you read. And by the time they were able to finally track down Jamie Reynolds, he too was dead, dying of a boating accident in 2004. They got this tip in 2003, so they had pretty much just missed Jamie Reynolds. It took them a good few months to actually find him, and by that time it was too late. It's also believed that both Morty and Reynolds were aware that they had killed the wrong woman eventually, especially as Steve Morty went into hiding for about 18 months following Jane's murder. And not that it is relevant, but they were also apparently never paid for this hit because, they completely and utterly screwed it up. And since Jane's murder, both her parents, Helen and John McGill, and Detective Ron Iddles have publicly stated that they believe that not enough resources were actually put into solving Jane's murder because at the time there was a massive and a heavy focus on Melbourne's gangland killings. And if you are Australian, you probably have at least heard of the gangland killings. But if you're not familiar, they were murders of several dozen underworld figures over a decade or so, starting in the late 90s. I'm really not super well versed on this topic in particular, so it might be something interesting to look up in your spare time, or there is actually, I believe, like an entire TV series about it, which I really should watch. I'm sure I would actually enjoy it. Getting off track as usual, Ron Iddles has actually also stated that he does believe it was a case of mistaken identity, and he believes that Steve Morty was the shooter. And unfortunately with that, this case is brought to somewhat of a dead end. Although we likely do know who killed Jane, no one has been held accountable and therefore justice has not been served. And this case cannot truly be considered a solved and closed case. I suppose there is a slight chance that others involved are out there still and could be arrested, but in the end, it appears this really was a truly tragic case of mistaken identity. An incredibly frustrating case, not just because we don't have an absolute conclusion, and her family do not have an absolute conclusion, and her children, and we likely never will, but also the fact that her murder was so incredibly senseless. Not to mention, of course, her three young children losing their mother so young. But let me know what you guys think about this case. I'll be very interested to hear your thoughts. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to Jane's story. And until next time, stay vigilant and stay safe.